My name is Amara, and the first time my father called me a loser, I was 9 years old, standing in the kitchen with a math test crumpled in my fist, the red ink of a C- bleeding into my palm. He didn't even look up from his newspaper, just flicked his wrist like he was shooing a fly, and said, "You're never going to amount to anything, Amara. A loser, just like your mother." My mother, who was scrubbing dishes so hard the sponge squeaked, froze for a moment, her shoulders hunching like she'd been slapped. I stood there, the word loser sinking into me like a splinter sharp and impossible to pull out. It wasn't just a word, it was a verdict, a prophecy I'd spend years trying to unwrite. I grew up in a small town in Ohio, the kind where everyone knows your business and nobody expects you to leave. Our house was a sagging 2-story with peeling paint and a front porch that creaked under the weight of my family's disappointments. My father, a mechanic who smelled of motor oil and resentment, ruled the house like a king who'd been exiled to a kingdom he despised. My mother, quiet and worn, was his reluctant queen. Her dreams of becoming a nurse buried under years of his criticism and 3 kids she could barely feed. My older brother Derek was the golden child, athletic, charming, the one who could do no wrong. My younger sister Lila was still a baby, then too young to understand the hierarchy, but already learning to stay out of the way. And me, I was the middle child, the invisible one, the one who was always too much or not enough, depending on the day. School was my escape, but even there I couldn't outrun the weight of my father's words. I loved books, loved the way stories could take me somewhere else, somewhere I wasn't Amara the loser. But I wasn't a straight A student. Math tripped me up, science felt like a foreign language, and my teachers, overworked and underpaid, didn't have time to notice the girl who sat in the back, scribbling poems in the margins of her notebook. I tried so hard to be good to be seen, but every test I failed. Every report card I brought home felt like proof that my father was right. I was a loser. And not just to him, to my classmates who laughed when I mispronounced words in English class, to my brother, who rolled his eyes when I asked for help with homework, even to my mother, who never defended me, who just looked at me with tired eyes and said, "Try harder, Amara." The wound deepened when I was 12, the summer before 7th grade. My father had been laid off from the auto shop, and money was tighter than ever. He drank more, his temper, flaring like a match, struck against dry wood. One night, I overheard him talking to my mother in the living room, his voice low and venomous. "Amara's useless," he said. "She's never going to be anything. We're wasting food on a kid who's just going to end up pregnant or on welfare." I was standing in the hallway, my bare feet cold against the linoleum, my heart pounding so hard I thought it would crack my ribs. I waited for my mother to say something, anything to defend me, but she didn't. She just murmured, "Don't say that, Tom." Her voice so soft it was like she wasn't even there. I ran to my room, the one I shared with Lila, and cried into my pillow until it was soaked. I was 12 years old, and I already believed I was nothing. That was the moment the splinter became a scar, a jagged line across my heart that would shape everything I did, every choice I made, every dream I was too afraid to dream. I didn't know then that scars can be strong, that they can hold you together even when you feel like you're falling apart. All I knew was pain, the kind that doesn't just hurt, but changes you, makes you smaller, makes you hide. By the time I was a teenager, I'd learned to stay quiet, to keep my head down, to avoid my father's gaze. But the word loser followed me everywhere. It was in the way my teachers sighed when I asked questions, the way my brother smirked when I tried to join his conversations, the way my mother's silence felt like agreement. I started to believe it wasn't just my father's opinion, it was the truth. I was a loser, destined to fail, destined to be nothing. And yet somewhere deep inside, there was a tiny spark, a stubborn flicker of something that refused to die. I didn't know what it was, then hope maybe, or defiance, but it was there waiting for the right moment to catch fire. High school was a battlefield. I wasn't popular, wasn't pretty, in the way that mattered to teenage boys, with their cruel laughter and their wandering eyes. I had curly hair that never stayed tame, a body that was too soft, too awkward, and a wardrobe of hand-me-downs that screamed poor. The girls in my class, with their glossy lip balm and their confident giggles, made me feel like I was from another planet. I tried to fit in, tried to laugh at their jokes, tried to care about prom dresses and football games, but I was always on the outside looking in. My grades were average, my social life non-existent. The only thing I was good at was writing stories, poems, essays that poured out of me like water from a broken dam. My English teacher, Mrs. Callahan, was the first person to tell me I had talent. "You have a voice, Amara," she said, handing back a short story I'd written about a girl who runs away to find a better life. "Don't let anyone take that from you." But at home my voice didn't matter. My father's voice was the only one that counted, and it was always loud, always cruel. When I was 16, I got a part-time job at a diner washing dishes to help with the bills. I was proud of it, proud of the $20 I brought home each week, proud of the way my hands smelled like lemon soap after a shift. But the first time I handed my paycheck to my mother, my father snatched it from her hands and laughed. This is what you're good for. Scrubbing plates like some nobody. You're a loser, Amara, and you always will be." My mother looked away. Her lips pressed tight, and Derek, who was home from college, just shook his head like I was an embarrassment. Lila, who was 7 by then, stared at me with wide eyes, and I wanted to tell her not to listen, not to let his words sink into her the way they'd sunk into me. But I couldn't. I just took the next shift and the next and kept my head down my heart, aching with every plate I scrubbed. That was my life, a cycle of trying and failing, of hoping and being crushed. I wanted to be more to prove them wrong, but every step forward felt like wading through mud. I was 17 when I started to dream of leaving, of going to college, of becoming someone who wasn't defined by my father's words. But college was a fantasy, something for kids with money and parents who believed in them. My guidance counselor, a tired woman with a desk full of unopened mail, told me I'd be lucky to get into community college with my grades. My father, when I mentioned the idea, laughed so hard he choked on his beer. "College for you. Don't waste my time, Amara. You're not smart enough, and we're not paying for it." My mother didn't say anything, just kept folding laundry, her hands moving faster like she could outrun the conversation. I felt like I was drowning, like the weight of their disbelief was pulling me under. But that spark, that tiny flicker inside me, was still there. It was small, fragile, but it was mine. And one day, when I was least expecting it, someone saw it too. I was 17, standing behind the counter at the diner, my apron stained with ketchup, and my hands raw from scrubbing pots. When Mrs. Callahan walked in, it was a slow Tuesday evening, the kind where the jukebox played the same 3 songs on repeat, and the air smelled of burnt coffee. She was alone, her gray hair pulled back, in a loose bun, her cardigan slightly frayed at the cuffs. I hadn't seen her since I'd graduated high school a few months earlier, barely scraping by with a diploma that felt more like a participation trophy than an achievement. She smiled when she saw me, her eyes crinkling at the corners, and for a moment I felt like I was back in her classroom, clutching a story I'd poured my heart into. "Amara," she said, sliding onto a stool at the counter. "I was hoping I'd find you here." Her voice was warm, like she was greeting an old friend, not a former student who'd barely passed her class. I mumbled a hello, wiping my hands on my apron, suddenly self-conscious of the grease under my nails and the way my ponytail was coming loose. She ordered a cup of tea, and as I poured it, she asked, "What's next for you? What's the plan?" The question caught me off guard. No one had ever asked me that. Not my parents, not my guidance counselor, not even myself. I shrugged, muttering something about saving up, maybe taking a few classes at the community college someday. But the truth was, I didn't have a plan. I had a paycheck that went straight to my mother's hands, a father who called me a loser, and a heart that felt like it was shrinking with every shift I worked. Mrs. Callahan didn't let it go. She sipped her tea, her eyes never leaving mine, and said, "You're a writer, Amara. You have a gift. Don't let it sit in a drawer somewhere." I laughed, a sharp, bitter sound that made the cook glance over from the grill. A writer, me. The girl who couldn't solve a quadratic equation, who tripped over her own feet, in gym class, who came home every night, smelling like fryer oil. But Mrs. Callahan wasn't laughing. She reached into her bag and pulled out a flyer, sliding it across the counter. It was for a writing contest, a national one for high school graduates under 20 with a cash prize and a chance to attend a summer writing program at a college in Chicago. "I think you should enter," she said. "I know you have something to say." I stared at the flyer, my fingers brushing the edge of it, afraid to pick it up. The deadline was in 2 months, and the entry required a 5,000-word short story. I hadn't written anything since graduation, hadn't had the time or the energy. At home, my father's voice was louder than ever, his drinking worse, since Derek had moved out to start his own life. My mother was a ghost fading into the background of our crumbling house, and Lila, now 10, was starting to mimic my father's sharp tongue, calling me dishwater when I came home late. The idea of writing a story, of putting my heart on paper for strangers to judge, felt impossible. But Mrs. Callahan's belief in me, that quiet certainty in her eyes, was like a lifeline thrown into the dark water I was drowning in. I folded the flyer and tucked it into my pocket, promising I'd think about it. That night after my shift, I sat on my bed, the flyer open in front of me. Lila was asleep, her soft snores filling the room, and the house was quiet. For once, my father passed out on the couch. I pulled out an old notebook, one I'd hidden under my mattress, filled with half-finished poems and stories I'd never shown anyone. My hands shook as I started to write the words, coming slowly at first, then faster, like a dam breaking. I wrote about a girl named Amara, not me, but close enough, who lived in a house where every word was a weapon. I wrote about her dreams, her fears, the way she carried her pain like a stone in her chest. By the time the sun came up, I had 3 pages, and my eyes were burning with tears I hadn't realized I'd shed. For the next 2 months, I wrote in stolen moments during breaks at the diner late at night, when the house was still even in the bathroom, balancing my notebook on my knees. The story grew messy and raw, but mine. It was about Mara finding a way out, not through magic or miracles, but through her own stubborn will. I poured everything into it, my father's cruelty, my mother's silence, the way I felt invisible, even to myself. When I finished, it was 200 words, and I had to cut it down, agonizing over every sentence. I typed it up at the library, my hands trembling, as I hit print and mailed it off, the day before the deadline, using money I'd saved from tips. Waiting for the results was torture. I didn't tell anyone, not even Mrs. Callahan, who I saw every week. When she came to the diner for her tea, I was too afraid of failing, of proving my father right. At home, things were worse than ever. My father had started a new job at a warehouse, but the pay was barely enough, and his anger seemed to grow with every bill that went unpaid. One night he came home drunk, slamming doors and yelling about how useless we all were. I was in the kitchen, making Lila a sandwich when he turned on me. "You think you're helping working that pathetic job?" He spat, his breath sour with whiskey. "You're nothing, Amara, a nobody. You'll be washing dishes for the rest of your life." Lila giggled, nervous and cruel, and my mother just stood there, her hands twisting a dish towel. I wanted to scream, to tell him about the story, about the contest, about the spark inside me that he couldn't touch. But I didn't. I swallowed the words, let them burn in my throat, and went back to my room. The letter came on a rainy afternoon in April, addressed to me in crisp black ink. I was alone in the house, my shift at the diner canceled because of a broken pipe. My hands shook as I opened it, the paper crinkling under my fingers. I read the first line and my knees buckled. "Dear Amara Ellis, we are pleased to inform you that your story, The Stone in Her Chest, has been selected as a finalist in the National Young Writers Contest. I read it again, then again, my heart pounding so hard I thought it would burst. I hadn't won, not yet, but I was one of 10. Finalists invited to Chicago for the awards ceremony, where the top 3 would be announced. The letter included a plane ticket, a hotel voucher, and a schedule for the summer writing program, fully funded if I placed in the top 5. I sat on the floor, the letter clutched to my chest, and cried. Not the quiet tears of shame I'd cried so many times before, but big, messy sobs that shook my whole body. For the first time in my life, I felt seen. Someone somewhere had read my words and thought they mattered. I wanted to call Mrs. Callahan to run to the diner and show her the letter, but I didn't. I was too afraid of jinxing it, of letting hope in only to have it crushed. Instead, I hid the letter under my mattress, next to my notebook, and went back to work the next day like nothing had changed. But something had changed. Inside me, that spark was growing, flickering into a flame. I started to dream again, not just of escaping, but of becoming someone. Someone who wasn't a loser, who wasn't defined by her father's words or her mother's silence. I started to believe just a little that I could be more. The weeks before the trip to Chicago were a blur. I lied to my parents, telling them I was visiting a friend for a weekend, using money from my savings to cover the bus fare to the airport. My father didn't care, just grunted and waved me off. But my mother looked at me for a moment, her eyes searching like she knew I was hiding something. I didn't tell her. I couldn't. I packed a small bag, my notebook tucked inside, and left for Chicago, my heart racing with fear and possibility. The plane to Chicago was the first I'd ever been on, and I spent the whole flight gripping the armrests, my stomach lurching with every bump of turbulence. I was 18 alone and terrified, not just of flying, but of what I was flying toward. The letter from the writing contest was folded in my pocket, creased from how many times I'd read it, and my notebook was in my backpack, the pages filled with Mara's story and my own jagged hopes. I didn't know what to expect in Chicago. I'd never been farther than Cleveland, never stayed in a hotel, never been around people who thought words on a page could change anything. All I knew was that for the first time in my life, I was doing something for me, something my father couldn't touch. The hotel was overwhelming, all glass and chrome, and people who moved like they belonged. I felt like an imposter in my thrift store jeans and faded sweater, my backpack slung over one shoulder as I checked in. The woman at the desk smiled, handed me a key card and said, "Welcome to the Young Writers Conference, Ms. Ellis." Ms. Ellis. No one had ever called me that before. It made me stand a little straighter, even as my heart hammered with nerves. My room was on the 10th floor with a view of the city skyline that took my breath away. I stood at the window, watching the lights blink like stars, and for a moment I let myself imagine that this was my life, that I was someone who belonged in places like this, someone whose name meant something. The awards ceremony was the next evening, but the conference started that morning with workshops and panels. I sat in the back of a crowded ballroom, clutching my notebook, listening to writers, real writers, with published books, and confident voices talk about craft and courage. They spoke about rejection, about the stories that lived in their bones, about the power of telling the truth. I scribbled notes until my hand cramped, my mind racing with ideas. For the first time, I didn't feel like an outsider. These people, strangers from all over the country, understood the ache of wanting to be heard. I was too shy to raise my hand or ask questions, but I soaked it all in every word, feeding that flame inside me. During a break, I met Priya, another finalist, a girl with bright eyes and a laugh that filled the room. She was from California, the daughter of immigrants, and her story was about a girl who defies her family's expectations to become an artist. We bonded over coffee-swapping stories about our lives, our fears, the way writing felt like both a lifeline and a risk. "My dad thinks art is a waste of time," she said, stirring sugar into her cup. "He wanted me to be a doctor. What about you?" I hesitated, the word loser flashing in my mind, but I told her the truth about my father's cruelty. my mother's silence, the diner job that paid for my family's groceries while they mocked me. Priya listened, her face softening, and when I finished, she reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "You're here, Amara," she said. "That's already a win." Her words stayed with me, a small anchor in the storm of my doubts. That night at the awards ceremony, I sat next to her, my hands twisting in my lap, as the MC, a woman with a voice like honey, read the names of the finalists. The room was packed, the air thick with anticipation, and I felt like I might be sick. Priya's story took third place, and I clapped until my palms stung as she walked to the stage beaming. When the MC called my name for second place, I froze my heart, stopping for a moment before it started racing again. Priya nudged me, whispering, "Go, go," and I stumbled to my feet, my legs shaking as I walked to the stage. The spotlight was blinding, the applause deafening, and I felt like I was floating outside my body. The MC handed me a certificate and a check for $2,000. Her smile warm as she said, "Amara Ellis, your story moved us all." I mumbled a thank you, my voice barely audible, and hurried back to my seat, the certificate clutched to my chest. Second place. Not first, but second out of hundreds of entries my words had been chosen. Priya hugged me, her arms tight, and I realized I was crying. Tears streaming down my face as the reality sank in. I wasn't a loser, not here, not now. The rest of the conference was a whirlwind. I attended the summer writing program, a 6-week intensive that came with my award. It was grueling, exhilarating, transformative. I wrote every day, my pen moving faster than my thoughts, spilling out stories and poems I didn't know I had in me. My instructors, all working writers, pushed me to dig deeper, to be braver. One of them, a poet named Dr. Nguyen, told me I had a singular voice, a phrase that made my chest ache with pride. Priya and I became inseparable, staying up late in our dorm, reading each other's work, dreaming about the future. She wanted to publish a graphic novel. I wanted to write a book, maybe a memoir, something that would tell the truth about where I came from. But even in Chicago, the shadow of home lingered. I called my mother once a week, using a payphone in the dorm lobby, my quarters clinking as I fed them into the slot. She asked about the weather, about what I was eating, but never about the program, never about my writing. My father didn't ask to speak to me, and I didn't ask for him. Lila, when she got on the phone, was distant, her voice sharp with resentment. Like I'd abandoned her by leaving. I sent half my prize money home, keeping the rest for books and supplies. But my mother never mentioned it, and I didn't know if my father even knew. Part of me wanted to tell them to scream that I'd placed second in a national contest, that I was learning, growing, becoming someone. But I didn't. The fear of their dismissal of my father's laughter was too heavy. When the program ended, I went back to Ohio. My notebook filled with new stories, my heart fuller but still bruised. Priya and I promised to stay in touch, and I hugged her goodbye at the airport, my eyes stinging as her plane took off. The bus ride home was long, the familiar fields and strip malls of my town, closing in around me like a fist. When I walked through the door, my father was in his recliner, a beer in his hand, the TV blaring. "Back from your little vacation," he said, not looking at me. "Hope you had fun, because it's back to reality now." My mother was in the kitchen, chopping onions, her back to me. Lila, sprawled on the couch, glanced up and said, "You look weird." No one asked about Chicago, about the contest, about me. I went to my room, the certificate and my notebook hidden in my backpack, and sat on my bed, the weight of their indifference pressing down on me. I wanted to cry, to scream, to run back to Chicago and never come back. But I didn't. Instead, I opened my notebook and started writing again, the words pouring out like they had that first night. I wrote about the girl who came home, who carried her scars like armor, who refused to let the darkness win. I wrote until my hand ached, until the page was blurred with tears, until I felt that flame inside me burn brighter than ever. The diner was waiting for me, the same greasy counter, the same tired faces. But I wasn't the same. I'd tasted something in Chicago, possibility, purpose, pride, and I wasn't going to let it go. I started applying to colleges using the library computer to fill out applications. My essays raw and honest, every word a piece of my heart. I didn't tell my family. I couldn't bear their skepticism, their dismissal. But I told Mrs. Callahan, who came to the diner every Tuesday, her tea steaming as she listened. "You're going to do this, Amara," she said, her voice steady. "You're going to be extraordinary." And for the first time, I started to believe her. The rejection letters came first, thin envelopes that felt like slaps. Ohio State, Kent State. Even the small liberal arts college I'd pinned my hopes on. They all said the same thing: my grades weren't strong enough, my test scores too low, my application lacking the polish of kids who'd had tutors and prep courses. I read each one in the library, hidden behind a stack of books, my chest tightening with every "we regret to inform you." I was 19, still working at the diner, my hands perpetually chapped from dishwater, my dreams of college slipping through my fingers like sand. But I didn't stop. I couldn't. Chicago had changed me, had shown me a version of myself I was desperate to become. So I kept applying, scouring scholarship websites, writing essays that bled with truth, each one a plea to be seen. Mrs. Callahan was my lifeline. She'd retired from teaching, but still came to the diner every Tuesday, her tea cooling as she read my latest essay drafts. "This is powerful, Amara." She'd say, her pen circling a sentence or suggesting a sharper word. "You're telling your story, and it's a story worth hearing." Her belief in me was a tether keeping me from sinking back into the despair of my father's words. At home, nothing had changed. My father still called me a loser, his voice slurring after his third beer. My mother still avoided my eyes, her silence a wall I couldn't climb. Lila, now 12, had grown sharp and distant, parroting our father's cruelty, calling me grease girl when I came home smelling of the diner. I sent most of my paycheck to my mother, keeping just enough for bus fare and library printing fees, but no one thanked me. It was expected, like breathing like failure. Then in the spring, a thick envelope arrived from a small college in Michigan I'd almost forgotten I'd applied to. I was alone in the house, my shift at the diner not starting for another hour when I tore it open. My hands shook as I read the first line. "Congratulations, Amara Ellis, you have been accepted to Grand Valley State University with a full tuition scholarship." I sank to the floor, the letter trembling in my hands, tears blurring the words. The scholarship was merit-based, awarded for my essay about growing up in a house where love was conditional, where my worth was measured by my failures. They'd seen me, not the C- student, not the diner girl, but me, the writer, the fighter, the girl who refused to give up. I didn't tell my family. I couldn't. The thought of my father's laughter, my mother's indifference, Lila's sneer, it was too much. Instead, I called Mrs. Callahan, my voice breaking, as I read her the letter. She cried with me, her laughter warm through the phone. "I knew you could do it," she said. "This is just the beginning." Priya, who I still texted weekly, screamed when I told her, demanding. I sent her a picture of the letter. "You're a rock star, Amara," she wrote, her words lighting up my cracked phone screen. For the first time, I felt like I might be. Leaving for college was the hardest thing I'd ever done. I packed my life into a single duffel bag, clothes, my notebook, the certificate from Chicago. A photo of me and Lila when she was a baby, before she'd learned to hate me. My father was at work when I left my mother in the kitchen, stirring soup like it was the only thing keeping her anchored. I told her I was going to school, that I'd gotten a scholarship, that I'd be back for holidays. She nodded her eyes on the pot and said, "Be careful." No pride, no questions, just those two words. Lila was at a friend's house, and I left her a note on her pillow. "I love you. I'm not leaving you, just finding me." I don't know if she read it. Grand Valley was a 4-hour bus ride away, and when I stepped onto the campus, I felt like I'd walked into another world. The buildings were red brick, the lawns green and sprawling the air, alive with the chatter of students who seemed to know exactly where they were going. I was terrified, certain I'd fail, certain I didn't belong. But I threw myself into it. Classes, study groups, late nights in the library. I majored in English, minored in creative writing, and every assignment felt like a chance to prove myself. My professors noticed. Dr. Larson, who taught my fiction workshop, pulled me aside after class one day and said, "Your stories have soul, Amara. Keep writing. The world needs your voice." I worked too, because the scholarship covered tuition, but not books or food. I got a job at the campus bookstore, shelving novels, and ringing up overpriced textbooks. It was nothing like the diner, no grease, no aching feet, no customers snapping at me to hurry up. I saved every penny sending a little home when my mother called to say the electric bill was late, but I kept enough to buy a used laptop, my first a clunky thing that hummed like it was thinking too hard. On that laptop I wrote stories, essays, a novel I was too scared to show anyone. I joined the campus literary magazine, submitting a poem about a girl who carries her pain like a stone. When it was published my name in print for the first time, I cried in my dorm room alone, but not lonely. I made friends slowly. There was Javier, a theater major, who loved my stories and made me laugh until my sides hurt. There was Aisha, a pre-med student who studied with me in the library, her focus inspiring me to push harder. They didn't know my past, didn't know the girl who'd been called a loser, and I didn't tell them. Not yet. I was learning to be someone new, someone who walked with her head up, who spoke in class, who believed her words mattered. But the scars were still there, tender under the surface. Every time I called home, my father's voice, my mother's silence, Lila's coldness, they reminded me of the girl I'd been, the one who'd believed she was nothing. By my sophomore year, I was thriving. My grades were strong, my professors encouraging my writing sharper than ever. I applied for a study abroad program in London, something I'd never dared dream of. And when I got accepted with a partial scholarship, I felt like I was flying. I spent a semester in England, wandering cobblestone streets, writing in cafes, soaking up a world so different from the one I'd known. When I came back, I was bolder, surer. I started submitting my work to literary journals, small ones at first, then bigger ones. Rejections still came, but so did acceptances. A short story here, a poem there, each one a brick, in the foundation I was building. I didn't go home often. Holidays were strained. My father's temper worse with every year, my mother's silence heavier. Lila was a teenager now, angry and withdrawn, blaming me for leaving her behind. I tried to reach her to tell her she could do anything, be anything, but she pushed me away, her words cutting like our father's. "You think you're better than us now," she said once, her eyes hard. I wanted to tell her I wasn't better, just different, just trying to survive. But I didn't. I sent money when I could, called when I couldn't, and kept my distance, my heart aching for the sister I'd lost. By my junior year, I was someone I barely recognized. I was Amara Ellis scholarship student, published writer, the girl who'd spoken at a campus literary event and gotten a standing ovation. I was still afraid, still scarred, but I was moving forward step by painful step. And then one day I got an email that changed everything. A literary agent who'd read my story in a journal wanted to talk about my novel, the one I'd been too scared to share. I sat in my dorm staring at the screen, my hands trembling, and realized that the flame inside me wasn't just burning. Now it was blazing. The email from the literary agent, a woman named Claire Voss, sat in my inbox for 3 days before I had the courage to open it again. I was 21, a junior at Grand Valley, sitting in my dorm room with the window cracked to let in the crisp Michigan air. My laptop hummed on my desk, the screen glowing with her words. "Your story in the Willow Review caught my attention. It's raw, honest, and unforgettable. I'd love to read your novel if you have one and discuss representation." My novel, the one I'd written in fits and starts late at night when my roommate was asleep, the one I'd never shown anyone, not even Dr. Larson. It was called The Stone in Her Chest, an expansion of the story that had gotten me to Chicago, a book about a girl named Mara, who claws her way out of a life that tried to bury her. It was my story, but not every page was me, but veiled a truth I was still too afraid to claim outright. I didn't respond right away. Fear held me back. The same fear that had kept me silent at home, the fear of being laughed at, of being told I wasn't good enough. What if Claire read it and hated it? What if she saw through the prose to the scared girl underneath, the one who still heard her father's voice in her head, calling her a loser? But then I thought of Mrs. Callahan, of Priya, of the professors, who'd told me my voice mattered. I thought of the girl I'd been at 17, writing in a notebook under her mattress, dreaming of a life she couldn't yet touch. I owed her this chance. So I revised the manuscript, polishing every chapter until my eyes burned, and sent it to Claire with a note that took me 2 hours to write. Thank you for your interest. Here's my novel. I hope you like it. The wait was agonizing. I threw myself into my classes, my job at the bookstore, my work with the literary magazine. Anything to keep my mind off the email, I checked obsessively. I told Javier and Aisha about it over coffee, my voice shaking as I admitted I'd sent my novel to an agent. Javier whooped, slamming his hand on the table so hard our mugs rattled, and Aisha grinned, saying, "Amara, you're going to be famous." I laughed, but inside I was terrified. I didn't want fame, I wanted to be heard. I wanted my words to reach someone, anyone who felt as invisible as I had. Claire called me 6 weeks later, on a rainy October afternoon. I was in the library shelving books when my phone buzzed in my pocket. I almost didn't answer. Unknown numbers usually meant bill collectors or my mother asking for money, but something made me pick up. "Amara, this is Claire Voss," she said, her voice calm but warm. "I finished The Stone in her chest, and I'm in love with it. I want to represent you. Can we talk?" I dropped the book. I was holding a paperback that hit the floor with a soft thud and sank into a chair, my heart racing. She loved it. She loved my book. We talked for an hour about Mara, about the story's heart, about what it meant to write from pain. By the end, I had an agent, a real agent, who believed in me. The next year was a blur of revisions and submissions. Claire was relentless, pushing me to make the book sharper, truer. She sent it to publishers, big ones, whose names I'd seen on the spines of my favorite novels. Rejections came, of course, some polite, some brutal, but Claire never wavered. "This is a tough industry," she said, "but your book is special. We'll find its home." And we did. In my senior year, a small but respected press, Riverstone Books, offered me a deal. It wasn't a fortune, $10,000 advance, modest by industry standards, but to me it was everything. My book, my story, would be published. It would be real. I graduated that spring, walking across the stage in a cap and gown, my diploma a weight in my hands. Javier and Aisha cheered from the crowd, their voices loud enough to make me blush. Mrs. Callahan was there too, sitting in the back, her smile so proud it made my throat tight. I'd invited my family, sending my mother a letter with the date and time, but no one came. Not my father, not my mother, not Lila, who was 16 now and hadn't spoken to me in months. I called home afterward, hoping for something, a congratulations, a softening, but my father answered, his voice gruff. "So you're done playing student," he said. "Time to get a real job." My mother got on the line, murmuring, "That's nice, Amara," before handing the phone to Lila, who said whatever, and hung up. I stood in my dorm, the phone still in my hand, and felt the old wound ache, but it didn't break me. Not this time. The Stone in her chest came out the following fall when I was 22. I moved to Chicago after graduation, renting a tiny studio apartment with my advance and a part-time job at a bookstore. The book launch was at a small indie bookstore, the room packed with strangers' friends and a few professors who'd made the trip. Priya flew in from California, her hug so tight it stole my breath, and Mrs. Callahan sat in the front row, her eyes shining as I read a passage. I was nervous, my voice trembling at first, but as I spoke, Mara's words, my words, the room seemed to hold its breath. When I finished, the applause was thunderous, and I felt something shift inside me, like a stone settling into place, no longer heavy, but solid grounding. The book didn't make me rich or famous, but it found its readers. Reviews called it heart-wrenching and brave, and I started getting emails mostly from people who'd read it. Women mostly some my age, some older, who saw themselves in Mara, who'd been told they were nothing, who'd fought to prove they were more. One letter from a girl in Texas said, "Your book made me feel like I could keep going." I read it over and over, crying each time, because that was why I'd written it. Not for money or fame, but for her, for me, for the girl I'd been. I started speaking at events, bookstores, libraries, small literary festivals. My voice, once so small, grew stronger with every talk. I told my story, not just Mara's, but mine, the diner, the rejections, the scholarship, the book. Audiences listened, some with tears in their eyes, and I realized I was doing what I'd always wanted, reaching people, making them feel less alone. Claire pushed me to keep writing, and I started a second novel about a sisterhood forged in hardship, inspired by Lila, though I hadn't seen her in over a year. Home was still a wound. I sent money when I could, though my own budget was tight. My mother called sometimes, her voice thin, asking about my life, but never really listening. My father never called, and Lila only texted once a curt "saw your book in a store." Weird. I wanted to ask if she'd read it, if she understood, but I didn't. I was building a life in Chicago, friends, a writing group, a community that saw me. But the ache for my family, for their approval, never fully went away. I didn't know then that it was about to come crashing back. One day, I got an email from a producer at a Chicago talk show, a local program with a loyal following. They'd read my book, seen my speaking events, and wanted me on their show to talk about my journey. It was a big deal, a chance to reach thousands of people, to share my story on a stage I'd never imagined. I said yes, my heart pounding with excitement and dread. I didn't know who'd be watching or how it would change everything. The studio lights were hotter than I'd expected, burning my skin as I sat on the plush gray couch, my hands clasped tightly in my lap to keep them from shaking. I was 23, and the Chicago talk show Morning Light was my biggest stage yet. The host, a woman named Lena with a warm smile and sharp eyes, had read the stone in her chest and called it a testament to resilience. Now she sat across from me, her questions pulling at the threads of my life, like a seamstress unraveling a quilt. The audience, a sea of faces blurred by the lights, leaned forward, their silence heavy with expectation. I was used to speaking by now bookstores, libraries, even a small TEDx event. But this was different. This was live broadcast to thousands, maybe tens of thousands across the Midwest. My story, my truth, was about to spill into homes I couldn't control, and the thought made my heart race. Lena started with the book, asking about Mara, about the girl who carried her pain like a stone. I told her how the story came from my own life, though I kept it vague at first, talking about growing up in a small town, feeling invisible, finding solace in writing. But Lena was skilled, her questions gentle but probing, and soon I was telling her more about the diner, about scrubbing dishes, while my family took my paychecks about the word loser that had been carved into me like a brand. I didn't name my father, not yet, but I described his voice, the way it could cut through me, the way it made me believe I was nothing. The audience was quiet, but I could feel their empathy, their anger like a current running through the room. Then Lena asked about my journey out, the scholarship, the contest, the novel. I told her about Mrs. Callahan, about Chicago, about the moment I realized my words could matter. I talked about the letters from readers, the girl in Texas who said my book gave her hope. My voice cracked, and I saw Lena's eyes soften, saw a few audience members wipe their cheeks. "You've come so far," Amara, Lena said, her tone almost reverent. "What would you say to the girl you were at, 17, the one who thought she'd never escape?" I paused, my throat tight, and then I said I'd tell her she's enough. that her worth doesn't depend on what anyone else thinks, that she's stronger than she knows. The audience applauded, a wave of sound that wrapped around me, and for a moment I felt invincible. The segment ended with Lena holding up my book, urging viewers to read it, and I walked off the set in a daze, my heart pounding with a mix of exhilaration and vulnerability. Backstage, the producer hugged me, saying, "That was powerful, Amara. You're going to touch a lot of lives." I thanked her, my voice shaky, and checked my phone. Texts from Priya Javier Aisha, all bursting with pride. A voicemail from Mrs. Callahan, her voice thick with tears. "I'm so proud of you, my girl." I listened to it twice, smiling through my own tears, and then I saw an email from Claire. "Just watch the show. You are incredible. We're getting calls from publishers. They want your next book." I stood in the green room alone and let the weight of it sink in. I was doing it. I was becoming the person I'd always wanted to be. But the high didn't last. 2 days later, I got a call from my mother. I was in my Chicago apartment, a cramped studio with a view of a brick wall, writing notes for my second novel. Her voice was thin-strained, like she was holding something back. "Amara," she said, "your father saw you on that show." My stomach dropped. I hadn't thought about them watching, hadn't thought about my words reaching Ohio, reaching the house where I'd grown up. "He's upset," she went on. "He says you made him look bad, talking about how things were." I gripped the phone, my knuckles white. I didn't name him. I said, my voice sharper than I meant. "I told the truth. That's all." She was quiet for a moment, then said, "He wants you to call him." I told her I'd think about it and hung up my hands, trembling. I didn't call. I couldn't. The thought of his voice, his anger, his dismissal, it was too much. Instead, I threw myself into work. I was writing my second novel, teaching a community writing workshop, and speaking at more events. My calendar was full panels, readings, even a guest lecture at a local college. My book was selling steadily, not a bestseller, but enough to keep Riverstone happy, enough to bring in royalties that paid my rent. I was building a life, a name, a future. But my mother's call lingered a shadow I couldn't shake. A month later, I was invited to speak at a women's conference in Cleveland, just an hour from my hometown. The theme was Rising Above, and they wanted me to share my story to inspire women who'd faced adversity. I said yes, partly because it was a paid gig, partly because I wanted to prove I could go back to Ohio on my terms. The event was held in a sleek convention center, the room filled with hundreds of women, young old some, in suits, some in jeans, all there to hear stories of survival. I was the closing speaker, following a lawyer who'd escaped an abusive marriage and a nurse who'd started a nonprofit. My palms were sweaty. As I took the stage, my notes clutched in one hand. But when I started speaking, the words came easily. I told them everything, not just the polished version I'd shared on Morning Light, but the raw, messy truth. I told them about my father's cruelty, my mother's silence, my sister's resentment. I told them about the diner, about the scholarship, about the book that carried my scars. I told them about the girl who'd believed she was a loser and the woman who was learning she was enough. The room was silent, then erupted in applause, women standing, some crying, some calling my name. I felt like I was floating, like I'd finally claimed my story, not just for myself, but for them. Afterward, I signed books at a table, my hand cramping, as I wrote messages for readers. Women lined up, telling me their own stories, abusive parents, dismissive partners, dreams they'd buried. I listened, my heart full, and realized this was my purpose, not just to write, but to connect, to lift others up. I was so caught up in the moment that I didn't notice her at first. Lila, standing at the back of the line, her arms crossed her face, a mix of defiance and something softer, something I hadn't seen in years. She was 17 now, taller, her hair dyed black, her eyes lined with coal. She looked like a stranger, but she was still my sister, the girl I'd rocked to sleep when she was a baby. I froze my pen, hovering over a book as she stepped forward. "Hey," she said, her voice low, almost swallowed by the chatter around us. "I saw you up there." I knotted my throat tight, waiting for the barb, the cruelty she'd learned from our father. But she didn't say anything else, just handed me a copy of The Stone in Her Chest, one she must have bought at the event. "Sign it," she said, not meeting my eyes. I wrote to Lila, my sister, my heart. "You're enough." She took it, her fingers brushing mine, and walked away without another word. I didn't sleep that night, replaying her face, her silence, the weight of the book in her hands. I didn't know what it meant, didn't know if she'd read it, if she'd understood. But for the first time in years, I felt a flicker of hope for us, for her. I went back to Chicago, back to my life, but Lila's presence stayed with me, a reminder that my story wasn't just mine, it was hers too, and maybe, just maybe, it could change something. The Cleveland conference was a turning point, not just for me, but for the trajectory of my life. I was 23, living in Chicago, my name slowly becoming known in literary circles. The Stone in Her Chest had sold modestly but steadily, and my speaking engagements were growing: universities, women's shelters, literary festivals. I was no longer the girl who hid her dreams under a mattress. I was Amara Ellis, author, speaker, a woman who'd turned her pain into purpose. But seeing Lila at the conference, her guarded eyes and the book clutched in her hands, stirred something in me, a longing for family, for reconciliation that I'd buried under years of independence. I didn't hear from her, after didn't know if she'd read the book or tossed it in a drawer, but her presence lingered, a thread I couldn't cut. A few months later, I got an invitation that felt like a lightning bolt. NPR, the national radio network, wanted me on a program called Voices of Resilience, a series featuring people who'd overcome adversity. They'd read my book, seen my Morning Light interview, and wanted me to share my story with their audience, millions of listeners across the country. Claire was ecstatic, calling it a game changer for my career. I was thrilled but terrified. This wasn't a local talk show or a conference room of a few hundred. This was national, permanent, a platform that could amplify my voice or expose my vulnerabilities to a world I couldn't control. I said yes because I'd learned that fear was a signal to keep going, not to stop. The interview was recorded in a Chicago studio, a small room with padded walls and a microphone that felt like it could hear my heartbeat. The host, a man named David, with a voice like warm gravel, put me at ease, asking about my childhood, my writing, the moment I realized I could rise above my past. I told him everything, more than I'd told Lena, more than I'd told the women in Cleveland. I named my father's cruelty, his words that branded me a loser. I described my mother's silence, how it hurt more than his anger. I talked about Lila, my sister, who I loved but couldn't reach, and how I wrote for her for the girl she might become. I cried just once when I talked about Mrs. Callahan, about the teacher who saw me when I was invisible. David listened, his questions gentle but piercing, and when we finished, he reached across the table and said, "Amara, your story is going to change lives." The episode aired a month later on a crisp November morning. I listened to it alone in my apartment, curled up on my couch with a mug of tea, my heart pounding as my own voice filled the room. It was raw, real, more vulnerable than I'd ever been. I braced myself for the fallout, emails, reviews, maybe criticism, for airing my family's secrets. What I didn't expect was the flood. My inbox overflowed with messages from listeners, women, men, teenagers, people who'd heard their own pain in my words. A mother in Oregon wrote that she'd left an abusive marriage after hearing my story. A college student in Georgia said she was applying to scholarships because of me. A man in his 50s, a veteran, said my book made him feel less alone. I read everyone crying and laughing, my heart so full it hurt. The NPR interview changed everything. My book sales spiked, climbing onto regional bestseller lists. Claire called with offers, publishers wanting my second novel, speaking gigs at bigger venues, even a potential TV adaptation. I was overwhelmed, grateful, but also afraid. Success felt fragile, like a glass I might drop. I kept working, teaching my writing workshop, drafting my new book, speaking when I could. But the spotlight was brighter now, and with it came attention I hadn't anticipated. One evening, I got a call from an unknown number. I was in my apartment eating takeout and revising a chapter when I answered. It was my mother, her voice shaking in a way I'd never heard. "Amara," she said, "your father heard you on the radio." My stomach clenched. I'd known this was coming, had braced for it since morning light, but hearing it still felt like a punch. "He's furious," she went on. "He says you humiliated him, telling the world he was a bad father. He wants to see you." I was quiet, my mind racing. See me? After years of calling me nothing, of taking my money, of laughing at my dreams. "What does he want?" I asked, my voice cold. She hesitated, then said, "He says you owe him an apology. For lying, for making him look bad." I laughed a sharp, bitter sound and told her I'd think about it. I hung up my hands, trembling anger and hurt warring in my chest. I didn't call him. I couldn't. But the call shook me, made me question whether I'd gone too far, whether my truth was worth the cost. I talked to Priya, who was now illustrating her graphic novel, and she said, "You didn't lie, Amara. You told your story. If he's ashamed, that's on him." Mrs. Callahan, when I called her, said, "You're not responsible for his feelings. You're responsible for your truth." Their words helped, but the wound was raw, reopened by my mother's voice, by the idea that my father still thought he could control me. Then came the moment I hadn't seen coming. I was invited back to my hometown for a library event, a reading and signing organized by the county's Literacy Council. It was a big deal, hundreds of people, local media, a chance to speak, in the place that had tried to break me. I almost said no, afraid of facing my family, my past. But something in me, that stubborn flame, said yes. I wanted to stand in that town in front of the people who'd known me as the diner girl and show them who I was now. The event was held in the town library, a brick building I'd spent hours in as a kid, hiding from home. The room was packed chairs, filled with strangers, old teachers, even a few diner regulars. Mrs. Callahan was there, beaming in the front row. I read from the stone in her chest, my voice steady, and then spoke about my journey, about surviving, about writing, about finding worth in myself. The applause was loud, heartfelt, and I felt a surge of pride, of belonging. But as I signed books afterward, I saw them, my father, my mother, and Lila, standing at the back of the room, their faces unreadable. My heart stopped. I hadn't seen my father in over a year, hadn't spoken to him since his drunken rants. He looked older, his face lined, his shoulders stooped. My mother stood beside him, her eyes on the floor, her hands twisting a scarf. Lila, 18 now, was next to her, her expression guarded, but softer than I'd expected. I kept signing my hand, moving mechanically as they approached. The crowd parted, sensing the tension, and I braced myself for a scene, for his anger, for the confrontation I dreaded. But it wasn't what I expected. My father stopped a few feet away, his jaw tight, his eyes flicking over the stack of books, the line of people, the poster with my name. "Amara," he said, his voice low, rough, you did this." It wasn't a question, but it wasn't an accusation either. I nodded, my throat tight, waiting for the rest. He shifted, uncomfortable, and then said, "I didn't know. I didn't know you could." He trailed off, and I realized he was struggling, caught between pride and shame. My mother stepped forward, her voice barely a whisper. "We're proud of you," she said, the words sounding foreign, forced. Lila didn't speak, but she held my book, her fingers tracing the cover, and when our eyes met, she gave a small nod, like a truce. I didn't cry, didn't hug them, didn't forgive them. I just said, "Thank you for coming," and went back to signing. They left soon after, and I watched them go. My heart a tangle of relief and grief. It wasn't the apology I'd dreamed of, but it was something, a crack in the wall, a moment where they saw me, really saw me. The crowd didn't know what they'd witnessed, but Mrs. Callahan did. She squeezed my hand later, saying, "You stood tall, Amara. That's enough." The library event left me shaken, like a house after a storm, still standing, but with the windows rattled. I was 23, and seeing my family, my father's halting words, my mother's tentative pride. Lila's silent nod had stirred something I couldn't name. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, maybe not ever, but it was a shift, a loosening of the knot that had tied me to their judgment for so long. I drove back to Chicago that night, the highway stretching dark and endless before me, my mind replaying the moment my father said, "You did this." His voice hadn't been warm, hadn't been an apology, but it was an acknowledgement, a crack in the armor of his contempt. I didn't know what to do with it, so I tucked it away, like a letter I wasn't ready to open. Life in Chicago moved faster after that. The stone in her chest continued to sell its quiet success, building a foundation for my second novel, which I was drafting with Claire's relentless feedback. I was speaking more keynotes at colleges' panels, at book festivals, even a workshop for young writers at a women's shelter. Every time I stood at a podium, every time I signed a book. For a reader who said my words had helped them, I felt that flame inside me burn brighter. I was becoming someone I'd never imagined, not just a writer, but a voice, a beacon for others who'd been told they were nothing. The NPR interview had opened doors, and Claire was fielding offers, a memoir deal, a teaching position at a community college, even a documentary pitch about my journey. I said yes to the memoir, no to the documentary. I wasn't ready for cameras to dissect my life, but the possibilities felt endless, dizzying. Yet the shadow of home never fully left. I called my mother every few weeks, our conversations short, careful. She'd ask about my work, my apartment, but never about my writing. Never about the book that had bared our family's scars. My father didn't call, and I didn't expect him to. Lila was the mystery. After the library, she texted me once a single line. I read it. No elaboration, no emotion, just those 3 words. I stared at my phone, my fingers hovering over a reply, but I didn't know what to say. Did she see herself in Mara? Did she hate me for telling the truth? I wrote back. I'm glad, and left it at that, hoping the door between us wasn't fully closed. One afternoon, I was at the bookstore where I worked part-time, shelving new releases when a package arrived for me. It was small, wrapped in brown paper, postmarked from my hometown. No return address. I opened it in the break room, my hands curious but wary, and found a silver locket, old and tarnished, with a note in my mother's shaky handwriting. This was your grandmother's. She'd want you to have it. My grandmother. My mother's mother had died when I was a baby. A woman I knew only through stories of her kindness, her strength. I clicked the locket open, and inside was a tiny photo of her, her smile soft but fierce. I held at my throat tight and felt a connection to her, to a woman who'd fought her own battles, who'd passed down a legacy I was only beginning to understand. The locket became my talisman. I wore it every day, its weight against my chest, a reminder of where I'd come from, of the women who'd carried their own stones. I started wearing it to speaking events, my fingers brushing it, when nerves crept in. One of those events was a scholarship gala in Chicago, a fundraiser for a nonprofit that supported first-generation college students. I was the keynote speaker, asked to share my story to inspire donors. The room was filled with philanthropists, educators, and students, the air thick with hope and ambition. I stood at the podium, the locket cool against my skin, and told my story, not just the pain, but the triumph, the way a scholarship had changed my life, the way writing had saved me. I talked about Mrs. Callahan, about Chicago, about the readers who'd written to me. I talked about my family too, not to shame them, but to show the truth, that love can hurt, that families can fail you, but that you can still rise. The audience was rapt, their applause thunderous, and when I stepped off the stage, a woman in a sharp blazer approached me. She was the director of the nonprofit, and she said, "Amara, we want to name a scholarship after you. The Amara Ellis Scholarship for Resilience, to help students like you." I froze, my heart pounding, and then nodded, tears stinging my eyes. A scholarship in my name. A legacy not just for me, but for others who'd been told they weren't enough. The gala raised enough to fund the scholarship for 5 years, and I met the first recipient, a girl named Sophia, who'd grown up in foster care and was starting at DePaul University. She hugged me, her voice shaky, as she said, "I read your book." It made me believe I could do this. I hugged her back, the locket pressing into my chest, and felt a purpose deeper than I'd ever known. This was why I'd written, why I'd fought, not just for me, but for her, for every girl carrying a stone. I didn't forgive my family, not fully. Forgiveness felt like a word too big, too final, for the mess of love and hurt we'd made. But I started to let go, to loosen my grip on the pain. I sent Lila a copy of my second novel when it was finished, a story about sisters finding their way back to each other. She didn't respond, but I didn't expect her to, not yet. I sent money home when I could, though my father never thanked me, and my mother's gratitude was always quiet, hesitant. I kept the locket, though, and I kept writing each word a step toward the woman I was becoming. One night alone in my apartment, I sat at my desk, the city humming outside my window. I opened my laptop and started a new document, not a story, but a letter to myself, to the girl I'd been at 17, to the women who'd read my book, to Sophia, to Lila. I wrote, "Your worth does not depend on someone else's validation. You are enough not because of what you do or what you achieve, but because you are. Keep going. Keep carrying your stone. Because it's not a burden, it's proof you're still here." I didn't publish it, didn't share it, but I printed it and tucked it into my notebook, next to the certificate from Chicago, next to the photo of me and Lila as a baby. It was my promise, my truth, my anchor. I don't know what comes next. Maybe Lila will call one day. Maybe my father will soften. Maybe my mother will finally speak. Maybe they won't. But I know this. I'm not the girl who hid from her father's words, who scrubbed dishes to prove her worth, who believed she was a loser. I'm Amara, the writer, the speaker, the woman who turned her scars into stories. I wear my grandmother's locket. I carry my readers' letters. I build scholarships in my name. And every day I choose to keep going, not for them but for me, for the girl I was, for the woman I am, for the world I'm still learning to love.